Hello. So, I wanted to make a quick video on a book that, or I guess a series of concepts that I was looking into for a while. I've made one video on this topic, specifically this person who looks into this topic before, and it was the video I made on post-atheist, living in a post-atheist USA, and a critique of cold case Christianity by Jay Warner. Well, Jay Warner is he's a fundamentalist Christian, very like of the American Protestant evangelical tradition, and I find those people to be incredibly interesting because they're not exactly relics of the old world that a lot of the more materialistic people would have you believe. They're not anachronisms, although some of their ideas can seem very, very strange and kind of backwards to a lot of people who are sort of trapped in a liberal, secular, materialist, reductionist paradigm. And I find them extremely interesting because they're halfway between a symbolic world and a literal world, because those people, to their credit, are people who don't know how to reconcile a symbolic viewpoint with a historical viewpoint or a literalist viewpoint, and so they get stuck in this weird place where they're treating symbols very, very seriously and very, very literally, and in this way they can seem like they're trapped in a drama or a stage play or something, where they're taking the characters of the stage play extremely seriously. And a lot of people will look at that and say that, oh, they're stupid, they don't understand metaphor, blah, blah, blah. And I think they actually understand metaphor a lot better than the people who are criticizing them, who have a sort of dim view of metaphor, or treat it as idiosyncratic or personal or subjective in the way that subjective doesn't mean anything except for I guess stuck in your own idiosyncratic paradigm. Now, I take metaphor very, very seriously, so seriously in fact that I do think that metaphor might actually be more fundamental, or as fundamental to reality, than something like a material law. In fact, even the concept of a material law is itself a metaphor, because obviously a law is something that is just a sociological contraption that people have made, or if not made, at least discovered. So this book, in his book Cold Case Christianity, he was very interested in defending the historicity of the four gospel accounts, and I was actually turned on to this book by a couple of evangelicals that I was meeting with because I wanted to understand their point of view. I'm personally a what you might call a classical polytheist. I don't think my views would be particularly out of sync with somebody who lived 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, or 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire. So basically, I have a perspective on this that's neither atheistic nor Abrahamic. So I can be fairly certain that I'm coming at it not with no bias, but without the usual set of biases that you would normally see in this debate, where you've got somebody who's the shrill, autistic materialist who's beating them over the head with the same arguments over and over again that people have done since the late 1800s and the French Revolution, and then you've got the evangelical claims that usually it's a lot of cliches. And so, like, I'm not really interested in having that same old discussion because, frankly, we've seen it way too much. So I try to come at things with a fresh set of eyes, as much as I'm able. But anyway, so his last book was like almost a historical forensic analysis of the last 4 books of the New Testament, I believe. If not the last 4, at least like the 4 ones that are the sort of story of the life and times of Jesus. And I looked at this, and I sort of offered my criticisms of why these aren't necessarily reliable historical documents. But I'm also well aware that these documents not being you can't really look at those documents and think like a retelling of some historical event that was meant to be very, very literal. They're clearly they're meant to be sort of interpreted as history, but also meant to be interpreted as mythology and like the founding of a people and like an origin story and a hagiography, like a folk legend, like the Arthurian legends or something like that. Now, that doesn't in any way detract from their relevance, their psychological relevance to people. And, I've said before that I think the whole, like, literal interpretation versus, like, metaphorical, and these two things aren't necessarily as opposed as people might like to think. However, I've pointed out some of the flaws in his readings of the Gospels as a historical document in that video. You can go back and look at it anytime you want. It's here on the channel. But I've since stopped meeting with the evangelicals that I was meeting with because they started presenting arguments that I found distasteful. Like, they told me that somebody had found Noah's Ark, and like I looked into it and it was some wood in a cave, and I'm just like, okay, look, I can't waste my time with stupid people, so like I'm just gonna leave that alone. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but then again, maybe it's not. Maybe I just don't want to waste my time with bad arguments. But I stumbled across Jay Warner again, weirdly, because I've been looking into the Discovery Institute and the Origin of Life research, or it's really not research, it's more of a mathematical, scientific, and philosophical critique of the origin of life from abiogenesis and also the emergence of new life forms. They get a little bit into the fine-tuning argument. And this actually meshes with my belief system pretty well because, as a polytheist and very influenced by the Hermetic traditions of the Renaissance and the Proto-Hellenistic world, I think that, it's my belief that it's a faith-based belief that the world was created through the work of a mind. Now, as to what the nature of that mind is, I probably have some differences with Stephen Meyer and James Tour and all these people who are criticizing the theory of abiogenesis. But the problem with the belief that I had, which is why I never talked about it before, is that I didn't really have any way of articulating why I believed what I believed. I'm just like, well, it's in this text, the rest of the text works. They predicted the, vibrations and all of these things. So I'm just going to go along with it and say that, the universe is probably also mental. We know that our minds influence the universe, so our minds are inextricably linked up with the universe in some way, shape, or form. I don't know the extent of that. And coming across Stephen Meyer's argument for intelligent design, like an old Earth intelligent design model, actually, it made a lot of mathematical sense. And I'm a person who has to have things understood and explained mathematically. If it's not mathematical, if you can't relate it back to mathematics, I don't want it in my brain. And so anyway, I was looking at this guy's research, and he pairs up with a chemist, Frank Tor, from time to time, and they talk about how difficult it is to synthesize life in a lab and how it's a kind of miracle that life came in the first place, and they speculate about it being of of a origin of a designing mind. Of course, they attribute that designing mind to like the Christian/Jewish God, and I don't, but it doesn't really matter because I think it's still interesting to listen to. And also their critics are useless. Like Professor Dave, one of their critics, that guy's just a fucking joke. I could get into him, but I don't really want to give him any more credit because he doesn't deserve any credit. Unfortunately, he's got this massive, 2 million follower base that he just does not deserve. But, when you appeal to the ignorant masses, you tend to, and tell them that they're intelligent, you tend to get a lot of attention. Regardless, I found Frank Torr interviewing Jay Warner, and I found out that he had a new book. So I figured since I got a lot out of the criticism of cold case Christianity, I think I might as well go back and look at the summary of his new book and see what I could gain out of that. Now, unfortunately, he starts with the assumption that everything he claimed in his book Cold Case Christianity was true and verified, which I think is unfortunate, but I can forgive him for that, seeing as he did write the book, so he has to assume that it's probably mostly right. This being said, I have already pointed out the flaws in viewing the Gospels as a historical document, and you can, like I said, you can go check that out anytime you want. Now, I think they're best viewed as a folk legend and an inspirational folk legend that operates as the founding of a particular lineage, intellectual lineage, that became very successful for reasons that are mostly ascribable to game theory. Now, in this book, it's called Person of Interest, and it's basically a giant historical fallacy, but I don't want to just call it a fallacy and leave it at that, because the fact is there's some things about Christianity that people have to account for, and I think part of the reason that people like Jordan Peterson are so successful, and I love Jordan Peterson, is that even though I don't necessarily like his new biblical stuff, some of it, but anyway, that's a whole other topic. Regardless, he basically analyzes history in a very biblical centric way, specifically a New Testament centric way, and he uses the fact that his Christianity has been a very successful meme, and he compares it to all these other religions that didn't necessarily take off. I think he mischaracterizes those religions quite a lot, especially Hinduism, because one of the things he says is that Hinduism has never influenced culture, and I think that's, I just think that's stupid. You can't look at the history of the world and say that Hinduism has never influenced anything. And I think we're still nowhere near, we've just scratched the surface of what specifically Hindu thought has to offer our society. And I don't think he's helping with that project at all. But this being said, aside from the blatant misrepresentation of other belief systems and their impact on culture, he raises a couple of interesting points. And one of those points is the sort of outsized impact that this person who by all accounts should have been a relatively obscure historical figure, definitely we shouldn't know his name 2,000 years after his death. So I find that it's interesting. Of course, he jumps straight to the conclusion that the reason that this belief system caught fire and took off and snowballed exponentially in its fan base is that everything the guy said was literally true. Now, that anybody with a functioning brain should be able to tell that that is sort of just this appeal to popularity and this appeal to history that shouldn't really be taken very seriously. But instead of pointing out the problems with historicism, which can basically be used to justify anything that's had popularity for any length of time. Hold on, give me a sec. Alright, sorry about that. There was some tour that passed by me and I had to switch spots. Okay, so basically I was talking about the historical fallacy and why the historical, or the appeal to history, can basically be used to justify anything that's had even a reasonable degree of popularity or success. And so instead of focusing on that, which I think is a pretty basic, like if you don't understand why the historical fallacy is not a good argument, then you need to like stop listening to me and go read something more foundational, because that's just very basic logic and I can't really help you if you don't understand that. So I thought it'd be more interesting instead to go into why certain things tend to catch fire and have an outsized impact. Like, so let's say you're making the historical argument or the popularity argument about a band, or let's say like a singer like Britney Spears, let's say. So you're looking at all the pop stars who have ever tried to be pop stars, all the child stars who didn't make it, who were just, you know, crashed and burned. And then you see this one shining light, this outsized impact of Britney Spears, like billions of albums sold and blah, 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 blah. And you're like, well, why did she catch fire like she did? Why did she have this outsized impact, this influence on music and culture and blah, 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 blah? And one argument that you can make is that's because Britney Spears is special in some way. And maybe she is. But I think another argument is that it's a mixture of the human mind having spaces in it for certain ideological constructs. So if you look all throughout history, you see like very recurring themes in people's mythologies. And whenever a theme sort of goes away, whenever it loses some symbol that fills that theme, then it just gets reinstated in a slightly different form, but very, very recognizable. So for instance, Christianity, I've made a video about this. Christianity is effectively a solar religion, and one of the oldest myths is like Greek, Roman, even Egyptian, is the idea of you've got the sun against Saturn. So people often think in symbolism that the sun and moon are opposites, but I've said this in another video that actually the sun and Saturn are also opposites. So this is where you get gold against black. So you've got Lord of the Rings, right? Lord of the Rings, Gondor, the West, is always viewed as this golden sort of Apollonian light. Saturn, by contrast, is black. It's darkness. It's devouring of its own. It's cannibalistic, fratricidal, and it also has the characteristics of being highly organized, structured, disciplined, rigorous. It's associated with negativity and all this stuff. So when you have this like sort of myth that's characterized by Horus and Set in the Egyptian pantheon, which later becomes Jesus and Satan, or Zeus and Kronos, is like very much the same thing. In fact, Kronos was Saturn if you translate the Greek to the Roman pantheon, and people knew that back then. And Saturn actually is a direct translation, or Saturn basically is the etymological root of the term Satan. Now, the difference this is kind of going aside, but the difference of the Greek and Roman pantheon is that Saturn was not an inherently evil thing. It was more like a necessary force in the world that had to be contended with. But regardless, and I think one of the reasons why Christianity is a bad force in the world, why it doesn't match the articulate structure of the human mind, is that it creates a good versus evil narrative, which is actually very, very childish, because when you realize that Saturn is just another part of nature, and in fact it's a part of you, then you stop viewing it as good versus evil thing, and you stop demonizing your neighbors, and you stop scapegoating them, right? So the goat is also a symbol of Saturn. It's the sign of Capricorn. Regardless, all that was an aside to say that the human mind has these stories that are clearly embedded in it. We see them echoed in every culture over and over and over again. And the Christian culture is actually nothing new. It fills these stories and it puts its own twist on them, and it sort of has progressed throughout the ages and told these stories in slightly different ways throughout all the different eras of the last 2,000 years. So, you know, I don't think that Jay Warner's like American Protestant evangelicalism has any real relationship to like what people believed in Byzantium, for instance, or like 1300s Middle Ages Europe. Like, I think he would be very, very foreign. In fact, I think if he went back there, he would be viewed as a heretic, as much as if he went back to like the Egyptian culture that predated it by, 2,000 years or something. So, when he's saying like the rhetorical question of like, why did this particular belief system catch fire, I guess you could make the argument that that belief system is special, but I would also say that the reason why it's special is because it fits a pattern, a story pattern that people have been going over and over in different ways for like pretty much probably since human beings started telling stories. So I guess that would be a more interesting take, because then you can start looking at the commonalities and differences between all these different ways of telling the same story, and you can get closer to a one true fundamental belief system. Now, these guys will often sort of bash on other belief systems like Hinduism and Buddhism and like Islam even. And I don't really have too much of a problem bashing on Islam, because I think Islam is probably a failed story. I think the structure of Islam is it prioritizes conquest and forced conversion too much, and I think that works really well if you're a desert society that can engage in like this sort of polyamorous like hypergamy, where one guy gets all the girls and then you send all the lonely single guys out to either die or get their 72 versions in the afterlife, or get their version in real life from the neighboring village. But that doesn't work on a global scale, which is why I think you see Islam drawing the ire of nuclear powers. That being said, I think their beliefs about Hinduism are, let's just say, as ill-informed as you would expect somebody living in sort of one of these incredibly evangelistic Christian societies would you would expect them to have that sort of limited of a view of Hinduism. And since Buddhism is basically just a derivative of a very simple sort of ship for export derivative of Hinduism, I think you can levy the same criticisms that they have of Hinduism as you can at their understanding of Buddhism. Now, just on the comparative religion note, Buddhism is, I don't think it's a very complete belief system. I think you can see that Buddhism has a lack of meaning sort of inside it, and I think that's because it was literally Hinduism that was shaved down to its very bare roots. And I think that when you shave a religion down to its roots and you remove all the symbols and you focus on the very like specific process of that system, you end up cheapening it in a way that leaves it vulnerable to sort of capture and take over from other systems. And I think the reason you can see that is that, like, one of the ways you can see that is, like, for instance, the Dalai Lama has basically completely keeled over to, like, modern liberalism, which itself is a belief system that tells this story in a very, very broken and backwards way, because it hyper-prioritizes the individual and the subjective will, and weirdly enough, also rationality. But it's this sort of weird facade of rationality. Anyway, I'm sort of going off on tangents here, but I thought I would basically give this little review of Jay Warner's latest book that I stumbled across synchronistically after making that video on cold case Christianity. And I thought instead of using the book to like taking the book on its own terms and talking about what it means, I thought I could use it as a more interesting vehicle to transition into talking about the historical fallacy, pragmatism, and comparative religion. So until next time, hope you found this informative.